"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The manager didn't even make eye contact. He just walked straight over, holding a clipboard like a shield, then looked the man up and down. His worn jacket, the faded scarf, the shoes dusted in road salt. "This lounge is reserved for active buyers," he added, his voice coated in false politeness. Then, without pause, he reached over and picked up the man's untouched espresso and tossed it into the trash, the dark liquid still steaming. "Let's not waste anyone's time, all right?" Around them, the showroom buzzed with quiet luxury. Sleek sports cars on rotating pedestals, soft jazz humming from the ceiling speakers, staff in tailored suits gliding past. A couple across the room glanced up, caught the scene, and quickly looked away. No one said a word. The man slowly bent to wipe a drop of espresso from his shoe with a handkerchief he carried. No outrage, no protest, no clue that the man they just dismissed was the owner of the luxury dealership opening across the street in less than 30 days. Long before anyone knew his name, before the press labeled him a pioneer, or the community praised him as a trailblazer, Dorian Hartley was just a boy standing on the other side of a dealership window. It was winter in downtown Ridgeport. The glass was fought from the inside, polished from the outside by the breath of a kid with big dreams and cold fingers. He wasn't looking at the cars. He was looking at the people inside. The warmth, the way they talked with ease, the sparkle of luxury that felt impossibly out of reach. His father, a retired mechanic, tightened his scarf and said gently, "Let's go, son. We don't belong here." Dorian never forgot those words, not because they hurt, but because he disagreed. Even at 9 years old, he didn't believe anyone had the right to decide who belonged where. Growing up in the east side blocks of Ridgeport, Dorian learned fast that the luxury car world didn't have space for people like him. It wasn't just about race. It was about access, perception, and invisible lines drawn in velvet rope. His mother cleaned homes for families who drove imported coupes with custom plates, while his father worked double shifts fixing engines he could never afford. At school, counselors pushed him toward trade work, despite his straight A's and love for numbers. Whenever he spoke about starting a business, teachers told him to be realistic, but the more they dismissed him, the clearer his vision became. It wasn't just about cars anymore. It was about rewriting the map entirely. Dorian's obsession wasn't with speed or horsepower. It was with experience. He noticed how luxury dealerships made people feel either like royalty or like they didn't exist. He noticed how the black families who walked into those places were either ignored or over-explained to, and he remembered every single moment he and his father were talked over, stared through, or followed silently by salesmen with sharp suits and sharper smiles. Those memories didn't harden him. They sharpened him. He started reading everything he could. Finance books from the local library, old automotive trade journal from recycling bins behind Ridgeport Auto Weekly. He learned to listen, to watch, to wait. And then he started moving. His first job was in detailing, scrubbing rims and vacuuming floors at a used car lot on the edge of town. He was 16. He worked faster than anyone else, not to impress, but to observe. By 19, he'd talked his way into an internship with a dealership group in Portland. They didn't have a diversity program, but they had a vacancy after someone quit, and Dorian made sure he was standing in the right place at the right time. He never bragged, never pushed. He just asked the right questions and remembered the answers. Eventually, the right people started to notice. And the wrong ones, they didn't matter anymore. Still, the closer he got to the heart of the luxury car business, the more barriers revealed themselves. He saw how decisions were made behind closed doors. Country club meetings, back-channel favors, unspoken rules wrapped in polite language. He watched promising minority candidates get passed over for promotion because they didn't quite fit the brand. He heard the coded phrases, "Not our clientele," "Wrong image, too urban." And sometimes he was the target. Once, at a corporate dinner, a regional director leaned in and asked him if he was part of the valet staff. Dorian smiled. handed the man his business card, and said, "No, sir. I actually just acquired a district." That moment didn't make the papers, but it made something else, a decision. Dorian realized he could keep climbing the ranks of a system never designed for him, where he could build something entirely his own. It wouldn't be easy. He'd need capital. He'd need partners who believed in more than tradition. And most of all, he'd need to find a location bold enough to matter, but strategic enough to survive. Ridgeport was still home, but was also still cautious, divided, slow to change. That's why he chose it, because what better place to challenge the rules than the city that taught them to him? The building he found had once been a bank, a tall, sterile structure with shuttered glass and fading letters. Most investors told him to pick a different site, somewhere flashier, more modern. But Dorian saw the poetry. A place where people were once denied loans would now become a place where excellence was undeniable. He secured the lease himself. No middlemen, no corporate names on the paperwork. Just one signature. Dorian Hartley, Black CEO, owner. And he wasn't finished. He called it Hartley Signature Motors. Not to make it about himself, but to make sure no one else could take credit. This wasn't just a dealership. It was a statement, a declaration. And, quietly, it was a promise to that little boy still standing outside the showroom window. This time, the doors would open. This time, the warmth would be shared. This time, when a father walked in with his son, no one would say, "We don't belong here." The lease was signed, the name was chosen, and the building was his. But that was the easy part. What followed was a wall of resistance that felt almost engineered. Financing, the lifeblood of any dealership, didn't come knocking. Dorian approached 10 banks. 7 wouldn't even schedule a meeting. 2 offered laughably small amounts at predatory interest rates. And the 10th, they smiled, praised his vision, and then quietly ghosted him when he refused to bring on a white strategic face for the business. One even said, it might help investors feel more confident. Dorian left that meeting more determined than ever. But with no funding and a gutted bank building collecting dust behind him, he started showing up in places he didn't belong. Venture capital panels, dealership trade shows, automotive networking events where no one looked like him, and no one expected him. He walked into rooms where suits whispered behind his back, where introductions were skipped, where he was asked, "Who do you work for?" instead of "What are you building?" And each time, he smiled, shook hands, absorbed rejection after rejection, then went home and studied harder. He built pitch decks by candlelight during blackouts in his East Side apartment. He learned how to forecast 5-year margins, how to reverse engineer dealership markups, how to design customer experience models down to scent diffusers in the showroom. He knew that when the moment came, he couldn't afford to be good. He had to be undeniable. To keep the lights on, Dorian took consulting gigs, quiet ones. He worked as a back-end strategist for mid-sized dealerships looking to optimize operations. They never put his name on the front page, but they used his systems. One dealer in Oregon doubled their customer retention rate using his CRM flow. Another in Nevada saw a 12% boost in conversion after adopting his service design. He built credibility brick by invisible brick, knowing one day those results would speak louder than his skin color ever could. He kept records, testimonials, data, all of it meticulously stored, preparing for the one meeting that might change everything. That meeting came in the most unexpected place. A community fundraiser in South Ridgeport held a high school gym where folding chairs creaked and a sound system crackled with every mic check. A woman named Andrea Pope, former CFO turned impact investor, overheard Dorian explaining his idea to a local pastor. She waited until he finished, then walked over, asked 3 sharp questions and said, "You've got 10 minutes. Impress me." He did. 2 weeks later, she wired the first $400,000 into a holding account. No strings, just belief. It wasn't enough to finish the project, but it was the first real sign that someone saw him for who he was, not who they feared he might be. But even with seed money, the road was brutal. Contractors quoted him higher rates, than they would anyone else, until he started bringing in competitive bids and calling them out publicly. Licensing delays mysteriously appeared, paperwork got lost, and fire inspections failed over non-issues. One inspector asked why the lobby included both Black and Latino cultural elements, suggesting it might feel off-brand for this level of clientele. Dorian just smiled, took notes, and requested a second opinion. He began recording every meeting, documenting every interaction, building a quiet trail of evidence, not to fight, but to protect the dream. Through it all, he never stopped showing up. Some nights he slept in the building, wrapped in a coat on an unfinished office floor. Other nights he'd drive out to watch high-end competitors operate, noting what they did well and what they missed. He treated every setback as a system to study, every insult as data, every delay as training. When vendors flaked, he drove the truck himself. When digital renderings didn't come through, he taught himself CAD. When a vendor refused to fulfill a contract unless payment was made up front and full, he called in Andrea, who told the man bluntly, "You're either on the right side of this or out of business in 5 years." He backed down. Word slowly began to spread. A Black man, building a luxury dealership from scratch. People didn't know whether to doubt him or be intrigued. Either way, they started watching. And for Dorian, that was enough. Because behind every locked door he faced, he wasn't just pushing for himself. He remembered the boys from East Side who got laughed out of their first interviews. He remembered his father polishing his shoes before job fairs that led nowhere. He remembered his mother whispering prayers over unpaid bills. This wasn't ego. This was repair. And still, through every long night, he whispered one sentence to himself like a mantra. They'll see, not just the building, they'll see who we really are. By spring, the structure had taken shape. The walls were up, the facade gleamed under the Ridgeport sun, and the showroom floor stretched wide and open, waiting to be filled with stories. Dorian walked the space in silence some mornings, long before his team arrived. Just him, the echo of his footsteps, and the weight of everything it took to get there. But the final stretch was never meant to be easy. Just as momentum built, resistance returned. This time quieter, more insidious. A supplier who'd promised an exclusive vehicle inventory pulled out at the last minute, citing internal alignment issues. A key permit stalled again, now under what they called site-level review. Rumors spread in dealership circles. People questioning how a Black-owned showroom could meet brand expectations. Some said he was fronting for someone else. Others whispered that the project was a PR stunt doomed to fail. But Dorian had learned by now, when they question your legitimacy, it means you've gotten close enough to threaten theirs. He didn't panic. He re-strategized. He called Andrea, outlined the obstacles without emotion, and mapped a workaround. When the supplier backed out, he reached out to a network of boutique importers he'd built over the years. People who trusted him, not press releases. It meant more logistics, tighter timelines, higher upfront costs, but gave him leverage. When a permit delay dragged into its third week, he quietly brought in a civil rights attorney specializing in discriminatory business practices. A few subtle conversations later, the review process accelerated without a single word of explanation. Dorian didn't fight fire with fire. He fought systems with structure. But perhaps the most defining decision came not from conflict, but clarity. As the dealership neared launch, advisors urged him to stick to the mold. Keep it upscale, minimalist, exclusive. Don't rock the brand. Don't confuse the clientele. But Dorian had never been building a dealership. He was building a redefinition. So, he made a choice that made everyone around him nervous. He reworked the interior layout to include a community space, a polished glass room inside the showroom where young entrepreneurs could host workshops, local schools could bring students, and aspiring mechanics could shadow master technicians. He added a gallery wall featuring Black inventors in the auto industry, names no customer had ever heard of, stories buried beneath decades of erasure. He trained his staff, not just on service protocol, but on the power of presence, on listening without assumptions, on how luxury could be felt without speaking a word. And then there was the hiring. While competitors recycled resumes from the same 10 country clubs and dealership dynasties, Dorian looked elsewhere. He went to community job fairs. He partnered with Ridgeport Tech to identify graduates with grit and vision. He hired a lead salesperson who'd been passed over 5 times at her previous job because she didn't look the part. He brought in a service manager who had once been a street racer turned technician, but who no dealership would touch because of a juvenile record. And most importantly, he didn't just hire diversity, he empowered it. Everyone on his team had decision-making power. Everyone's voice mattered in strategy meetings. People didn't just clock in, they built alongside him. Of course, it wasn't without pushback. An investor pulled out quietly, claiming branding concerns. A rival executive warned him he was making things political. Even Andrea, ever supportive, raised an eyebrow and asked, "Are you sure the market is ready?" Dorian just smiled and said, "They don't need to be ready. We do." Because readiness wasn't about permission. It was about preparation. Opening day loomed. The team worked around the clock. There were setbacks. A delivery truck got into an accident. Signage was installed 2 days late. The server backend crashed the night before soft launch. But no one quit. No one panicked. Dorian had built more than a dealership. He had built belief. And in the final week, that belief was visible. The glass sparkled. The leather interiors were steamed to perfection. The playlist in the showroom was curated by a local DJ. And right by the front entrance, under a spotlight, hung a single-frame quote. It was handwritten. It read, "No one gets to tell us where we don't belong." The day before the grand opening, Dorian stood on the showroom floor alone. This time, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel like he was on borrowed ground. He looked around and saw every obstacle that tried to stop him, reflected in polished floors, rebuilt in every bolt, reclaimed in every corner. He didn't build this place to fit in. He built it to be undeniable. And as the sun dipped behind a Ridgeport skyline, he walked out the doors knowing something they didn't. Legacy doesn't ask for permission. It creates space. The morning of the grand opening arrived beneath a sky so clear it felt rehearsed. The sun struck the glass panels of Hartley's signature motors at the perfect angle, casting golden reflections across the newly polished showroom floor. A line had already formed before sunrise. Some curious, some skeptical, some simply wanting to witness what had never been done before. Dorian stood behind the tinted glass for a long moment, not as a businessman scanning the crowd, but as a man recognizing the moment he once only dreamed about. Inside, the team moved with precision. Every surface gleamed. Every scent diffuser released a faint note of cedar and citrus. Every employee wore not just a uniform, but a sense of purpose. At 9 a.m. sharp, the doors opened, not with fireworks or confetti, but with quiet confidence. The first person to step inside was an older gentleman, dressed modestly, his cane clicking softly against the marble floor. He looked around slowly, then turned to the young greeter and said, This feels different." That single sentence hit deeper than any headline. As the hours passed, the showroom filled. Clients browsed. Some came with wallets thick enough to buy the most expensive models on display. Others simply came to look, to feel, to believe. The staff welcomed them all the same. There were no judgmental glances, no passive dismissal, no pressure, just conversation, clarity, and care. Dorian made sure of that. He walked the floor not as a figurehead, but as a listener, shaking hands, sharing stories, answering questions. And when someone inevitably asked if he was the manager, he smiled, nodded, and said something like that. In the afternoon, a woman in her late 20s stepped in holding her toddler son. Her shoes were worn, and her coat had seen too many winters. She wandered to the center display where a deep blue coupe shimmered under soft lighting. A staff member offered her a bottle of water and said, Would you like to sit in it? She hesitated. I'm not buying today, she whispered. That's okay, the employee replied gently, opening the door for her. This space is for everyone. She slid in carefully, her son giggling as he pressed the horn. For a few minutes, the showroom belonged to them. Outside, a local news team arrived to cover the launch. Their headline read, Ridgeport's first black-owned luxury dealership opens with purpose. But for those inside, it wasn't about headlines. It was about moments. A woman who had been told she was too urban for sale shook hands with her fifth client before noon. A teenager from East Side who once detailed cars for $8 an hour stood proudly as the new assistant inventory lead. A father who brought his son just to see what black excellence looks like in real life, left with tears in his eyes. This wasn't just commerce. This was reclamation. Later that evening, as the sun dipped and the final customer walked out, Dorian called the team into the community space. They stood in a circle, some in heels, some in work boots, all in disbelief at what they had pulled off. Dorian didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. He just looked at each of them, then pointed to the wall behind him where the quote still hung. No one gets to tell us where we don't belong. There were no fireworks, no champagne, just a few claps that turned into a quiet round of applause. Raw, tired, honest. After everyone left, Dorian stayed behind. The showroom was still, its lights dimmed but glowing just enough to trace the edges of every carefully chosen detail. He walked to the corner where the very first car had been delivered, a matte black sedan. Understated but stunning, he leaned against it gently, thinking back to the countless nights spent alone in this building, imagining this exact moment. Except now, it wasn't imagination. It was real. The glass was warm from the day's light. The air carried traces of laughter and leather. And in that silence, he finally let himself breathe. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Andrea. Told you they'd come. And this is just the beginning. He smiled, not because she was right, but because she never once doubted it. He looked back once more at the empty floor, the doors locked for the night, and whispered to no one in particular, let's build something bigger next. Because for Dorian Hartley, the dream had never been just to open a dealership. It was to open the door for everyone who'd ever been told to turn away. Dorian never wanted to be a symbol. He didn't build Hartley signature motors to prove anything to anyone, at least not anymore. But standing there weeks after the opening, watching a teenager from his old neighborhood explain engine specs to a client in a tailored blazer, he realized that whether he intended it or not, the building had become something more. It was no longer just a showroom. It was proof. Proof that excellence didn't need approval. That dignity didn't need a gatekeeper. That success, when built from truth, speaks louder than any stereotype ever could. He often thought about the ones who never made it this far. The classmates who dropped out not for lack of talent but lack of space. The elders who worked themselves into the ground but were never invited to sit at the table. The entrepreneurs with brilliant ideas who couldn't get a loan, a meeting, or even a return call. For them, the doors of opportunity were shut tight. Dorian didn't just want to pry those doors open. He wanted to remove them entirely. Because what's the point of success if it can't be shared? So he began hosting open houses, not for sales but for mentorship. He invited young students, community leaders, even former competitors. He shared his blueprints, answered questions others would have guarded behind NDAs. When someone asked, "Aren't you giving away your secrets?" he smiled and said, "They're not secrets. They're steps, and no one owns the right path." He believed in competition, yes, but he believed more in collaboration, because legacy, to him, wasn't about being the only one who made it. It was about making sure he wasn't the last. He partnered with Ridgeport Tech to start a paid internship program, giving hands-on experience in auto sales, finance, and design. He launched a grand initiative for young black entrepreneurs launching businesses under $25,000. And quietly, without press releases, He co-funded repairs for several small East Side garages, struggling to stay open. He remembered what it was like to need help but be too proud or too invisible to ask. Now he simply gave without the burden of gratitude. Still, there were moments of resistance. There were whispers that he was trying to make things about race, that he was injecting politics into commerce. That luxury should remain neutral. But Dorian knew better. He knew that neutrality often meant protecting the status quo, and the status quo had never protected him. So he chose clarity instead. He spoke openly about barriers, about bias, about what it meant to be followed in showrooms and dismissed in boardrooms, not out of anger, but out of truth. And when he did, people didn't turn away. They leaned in. One night, during a community Q&A, a young man stood up, nervous, hands shaking, and asked, "What if I'm not enough? What if I fail?" Dorian paused. The room went still. Then he said softly, "You will fail, probably more than once, but that doesn't make you not enough. That makes you ready." He shared how he'd been told to quit, to wait, to blend in, how he was offered easier paths that led nowhere, and how every no he received became the foundation of a stronger yes. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The silence was deeper than any cheer. As time passed, Hartley's signature motors didn't just grow, it multiplied. He opened a second location on the West Coast, co-owned by a former intern. Then a third, in a city where no one believed the brand would succeed. Each site was different in style, but identical in mission. Luxury, built with purpose, built for everyone. And yet, whenever someone asked him what he was proudest of, he didn't mention the sales numbers or the media coverage. He pointed to a framed photo in his office, his father and him standing outside their old apartment building. His father was laughing. Dorian, maybe 10 years old, had a model car in hand and shoes too big for his feet. Below the frame, a quote etched in brass: "We don't dream to escape reality. We dream to rebuild it." That's what it was always about. Not rebellion, not revenge. Rebuilding, one floor tile at a time, one job at a time, one voice at a time. Because Dorian knew what it meant to feel unseen. And now, he dedicated his life to making sure others never had to. So if you're watching this wondering if your background disqualifies you, if your zip code, your accent, your skin, your bank account makes you less than, remember this story. Remember that resilience is louder than rejection. That belief doesn't come from what others think. It grows from what you build when no one's watching. You don't need a seat at their table. You can build your own. And when you do, leave the doors open. Someone like you is still out there, waiting to walk in.